Hello, St. Stephen's. It's nice to be seen by you, even though I can't actually see any of you. Let me start by reading these words from Isaiah 9, verses 1 to 7. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle, and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Now, just like the words Rachel brought us from Isaiah 40 last week, comfort my people, this passage too from Isaiah 9 is also echoed in the lyrics to Handel's Messiah. Unlike Rachel last week, I will definitely not be singing anything for you. And also, I must confess, as I muse on this proclamation of the child who is given unto us, my thoughts turn first not to music, but to some of those baby and birth announcements that I've come across just lately. Is it just me, or has telling people you're having a baby become a creative industry in and of itself in the past few years? We have the famous celebrity ones, of course, but on social media, the masses seem to have been mucking in. Perhaps you've seen a version of this one. There's another song I'm not going to sing for you. Or perhaps you've seen one of these eviction notices that are cropping up all over the place these days. And here's one more topical one I saw just the other day. Baby announcements. Well, in the opening chapters of Isaiah, the prophet comes back several times to a birth that is being announced. And it's a birth unlike any other. And the announcement of this birth is really rather unusual in a number of ways, perhaps even weirder than some of the ones you've just seen. For a start, the arrival of this child is for Isaiah the turning point. It changes everything. Our reading today begins with announcing a great nevertheless to all that has come before in Isaiah's prophecy. We go on to hear that this birth marks the end of the former time and the beginning of the latter time, and that this child is a light that shines into the people's darkness. Now, those of you with children may say to me, yes, Mark, though they are, of course, the little lights of my life, I absolutely do consider the arrival of my children to be the dividing line between the former time and the latter time, and life BC is but a distant memory. To which I, as the father of two, shall obviously reply, yes and amen. But it's not just that. To get a sense of this darkness and this former time, we have to read the previous 8 chapters of Isaiah. And they don't make for easy reading. Isaiah is called by God to be a prophetic voice among his people Israel. And this 8th century BC, that's before Christ, not before children, this 8th century BC community of God is broken and lost and endangered. The northern part has been conquered, plundered, and its people have been forcibly relocated to a foreign empire. What's left desperately needs to relearn how to seek God and how to live as the community God created them to be in the world. But they are under poor leadership of an unfaithful king who is only making things worse. And so, with no apparent solution and no discernible end in sight, this community lives under the constant threat of invasion, foots heavy bills to foreign powers to ensure its safety, and has little realistic chance of things ever being otherwise than they are right now. They have lost what they once had. Their present reality is insecure and their future uncertain. Perhaps some of that sounds familiar. Perhaps it will strike you that there are some parallels here with the lives of communities around the world in our present predicament, as well as with our own communities and our own lives. But Isaiah 8 finishes unflinchingly with Israel sitting there in darkness, able to see nothing, no matter which way they turn and look. Where will it end? Where will we end up? And then we get to Isaiah 9, and now, in the darkness, there's this flickering rumor of a God of compassion who will forgive and comfort, of a God of renewal who will restore and bring joy, a light shining in the darkness. And if last week Rachel brought us that message of the way God calls us to come into his comfort and joy, then this week we hear of the way God comes into our darkness in order to bring us that comfort and joy. And that all appears to hinge upon the birth of this mysterious child. So, who is he? Who is this child? Well, here's another weird thing about Isaiah's baby announcement, because, some of my friends have given their children very beautiful names. Some of my friends have given their children very long and somewhat unusual, beautiful names. But never have I come across a name quite like this. This baby announcement says, please welcome to the world a son, and his name is Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. In case anyone listening in is looking for baby names at the moment, here is how you would roughly spell this Hebrew name. Let's face it, not even a Hollywood A-lister child could pull this one off. But the names, they matter to the prophet Isaiah. They tell you something about who this child is and what this child is going to do. His name is Wonderful Counselor. A counselor is someone wise who can speak hope and possibility into our situation. A counselor is someone who sees how things are, who sees what needs to change, but more than that, who has the skill and the resources to take the people where they need to go. This child is a wonderful counselor. Where Israel has abandoned and lost its counsel, God is about to restore it through a counselor who will be not just a truth teller, but a waymaker, a wondrous counselor. And this child's name is Mighty God. He brings God's riches into our poverty. He brings all of God's strength into our weakness. And this child's name is Everlasting Father. Some people translate this as Father of the future. He is the one who ushers something new into being. He will open a future, father a future, where a way was not previously clear. And this child's name is Prince of Peace. He will meet us in our anxieties and all of our unknowns. His very presence changes the mood and changes the conversation. And his work among us will bring order out of chaos. In other words, for Isaiah, who he is and what he is called and what he does are inseparable. This is who he is. This is his name. This is what he does. And remember as well, we've already heard in Isaiah 7 about this young woman who will be with child and will bear a son and will name him Emmanuel. There's another name, a name that means God with us. God with us. And now here's a third strange thing about this baby announcement. Both the names and also the other things that this passage says about this child. Isaiah is not just telling us things like he was born weighing so many pounds and measuring so many inches. He is telling us what this child will go on to do and achieve in later life. Now, I've never seen that before. That would be like receiving a message, opening it up and reading, oh, such and such was born safe and well last Friday. She will be an excellent tennis player, move to Ireland, play the violin reasonably well, and make a cracking carbonara. What on earth is going on in this baby announcement? Many passages in Isaiah describe what this child will grow up to do. And toward the end of today's reading, Isaiah tells us especially two things. First of all, this child will grow up to be a new king like King David, creating a kingdom that will flourish forever. Of his government and of peace there will be no end. And in Isaiah 11, we hear about this king as a root of Jesse, who will not only gather in the exiles of Israel, those who have been lost and displaced, but will invite in people from across the nations. And we hear about this ruler who will not so much win a war as win against war itself, who will bring reconciliation among the peoples, so much so that the boots and clothes of battle can be burnt, and the swords and spears, this is Isaiah 1, can be repurposed into plowshares and pruning hooks, because none of that stuff is necessary anymore. We even hear that creation itself will experience some kind of healing. The wolves are with the lambs, the calves are with the lions. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, we hear that the life of this growing kingdom of peace will always be shaped by justice and righteousness for all. This child will pierce the darkness of human hearts, but also break the bar of oppression that sits on the people's shoulders, economic and social hardship, exclusion of the outcast, the crushing of the poor will end with his reign. And this repeated mention of justice and righteousness as a pair, these are covenant words, and they speak of both a compassionate response to those in need, on the one hand, and working towards an ordering of society for the inclusion and well-being of all, on the other. So this promise, it's not just a birth announcement, it's a coronation of a king who is still to come. And again, we ask, who is this child? Well, no doubt, Isaiah saw some fulfillment of his vision in the arrival of a new and better king in his own day, King Hezekiah, who would call people back to God and would restore some sense of peace and hope in the 8th century BC. But that fulfillment was very partial and very brief. And so the book of Isaiah as a whole goes on pondering and hoping for the fulfillment of these words. In Isaiah 43, for example, we hear of the God who says, I formed you and I will redeem you. I will gather you. Do not remember the former things, the former time, or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? Still the people wait and ponder and hope. Which brings me to the last odd thing about this baby announcement. It turned out to be made 800 years in advance of the birth. Now, I know some of us have 5-year plans, some of us have 10-year plans, but God apparently has an 8th century plan. And in the first century, these ancient words from Isaiah 9 were still whispered in the hope that there would be someone to come, a wonderful counselor, God with us. And so it was that 800 years later, there was another very strange baby announcement, this time one delivered by an angel to a young woman concerning the Son of God, whose kingdom will have no end, who will be conceived in the power of the Spirit of God, born to Mary and named Jesus. And we sing these words from Isaiah 9 each year and read these words from Isaiah 9 each year because the first Christians came back to this passage and saw its fulfillment in the birth of Jesus, the wonderful counselor who teaches and heals and changes lives, the Prince of Peace who died for us but now lives forever to reconcile us to God and to one another, the Father of our future, who makes a way for us where there appears to be none, and will one day return to usher in fully his kingdom of justice and righteousness, and who, mystery of mysteries, is even called Mighty God in the flesh, who became like us in order to restore us. God with us, Emmanuel. There will be many things to take away from this great promise, but my prayer is that there are three things this strangest of baby announcements will stir in us in the days and weeks to come. The first is to see that the same light is still shining in the darkness of our world and our lives today, just as Isaiah sees this light shining in the personal as well as the political darkness of his own day. And perhaps it shines all the brighter this year for the season we're in. In one sense, there are glimmers of hope for the coming season, aren't there? There's the promise of vaccines, a return to business as usual, but there is also desperate need. There is also unseen impact. There is also huge uncertainty and a slow recovery ahead. Even so, it makes so much sense that this year of years should finish like any other year, that together with Isaiah, we should be honest and open about the darkness that surrounds us and how we're coping with it. And together with Isaiah, that we might lean into the mystery and the hope of God with us. That's the first thing. The second is to know that the light of Christ that shines doesn't expose us, but comes to bring comfort and joy to us as it shines down upon our faces. Where this Advent do we need to know his wonderful counsel in our lostness and brokenness? Where do we need to know the might of God in our poverty and weakness? Where do we need to know the future of the everlasting Father in our present? And where do we need to know the Prince of Peace stilling us and bringing order in chaos? That's the second thing. And then the third is to hear this call to serve a kingdom that is always shaped by righteousness and justice in the days that are to come. What really strikes me about Isaiah 1 especially is that in the moment of darkness, when the country is ruined, the city's burnt out, the crops have failed, the reserves depleted, and the future insecure, the call of God is actually the same as ever, to turn to him and be restored, and simultaneously to seek justice, help the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. There is this connection between knowing God's comfort and joy and bringing God's comfort and joy in our communities and in our world. The news this week has continued to make clear that many parts of the world, parts of this country, parts of this city will be in desperate need in the year to come, even as life as normal, in some senses, resumes elsewhere. And the news this year has highlighted so much the imbalances and the injustices and the exclusions that continue to do damage to our communities. Our life-giving call, then, as individuals and as a church in the coming year, will be in our prayer and our action to give as we receive and to pursue this kingdom of justice and righteousness. Amen.